He was born in South Africa, grew up during apartheid, and went on to work with Nelson Mandela. So without further ado, let's welcome Chris Lubbe.
Where I come from in South Africa, I come from a place called Durban, which is on the East Coast. We have a special Zulu greeting which says, Sawubona. And Sawubona literally means, I see you. And until you say to the person that you meet, I see you, or Sawubona, they don't exist. And when you say it, you bring them into existence. This greeting is rooted in that incredible African philosophy called Ubuntu, which teaches us that I am because of you, and you are because of me, and together we are. And two of my great heroes, one being Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, lived and practiced and led by this ethos. In fact, when I took my two sons to meet Desmond Tutu for the first time, it was incredible how he greeted them. He said, Sawubona. And then he went on to explain the importance of this Zulu greeting. Sadly, where I grew up at a time, to coin a phrase from Martin Luther King, when the color of your skin was more important than the content of your heart. I grew up during this very, very difficult period called apartheid, where it was legal to be racist. Apartheid laws were passed in South Africa, and people of color, so if you were Asian, black, or mixed race like myself, you were treated differently to those who were white. And in fact, the whole idea behind apartheid was to make sure that people are not seen. So by enacting this law, suddenly a whole group of people, almost 50 million South Africans, became unseen because of the color of their skin. And apartheid was underpinned by one crucial law, which was called the Population Registration Act. So at birth, children were classified either white, mixed race or colored, like myself, Asian, or black. Those were the four race categories. But if you were white, you got to enjoy all the privileges of being a South African, including the right to vote. Non-whites were totally excluded from the political process. And so Parliament and the government only consisted of white members. And when you were born, you were given a birth certificate, and your birth certificate reflected your race, and it determined every part of your life from there on. Where you could work, where you could live, who you could marry, the type of education you could get was determined by your birth certificate, which bus you could go to, which beach you could swim on. And so every aspect of life was determined by this. And as I mentioned earlier on, I was classified colored. In fact, many people were classified as other coloreds because the government didn't bother to find out exactly their real heritage. So there was a lot of this othering that was going on. And part of the process of being classified was what the government did when parents brought their children to be registered. You'd be issued with firstly, your parents had to take you as a child, and you had to have hair. And when you came to the registry office, the officials would check the child out, and if they were not sure of the child's race, they would measure how thick the child's lips are. They would measure how wide the child's nose is. And if they still were unsure, they would actually do what they called the pencil test. So literally, a pencil would be pushed through the child's hair. And if the pencil fell to the ground, the child would be classified white. But if the pencil got stuck in the child's hair, the child would be classified mixed race or colored. But it doesn't end there. If a child is classified white and their parents are non-white, they would either be taken away or they'd be sent to an orphanage. Because the government's policy was that non-white parents couldn't raise a white child. So it's just incredible how a crinkly strand of hair could determine your entire future. And God help you if your hair wasn't combed thoroughly and you went to have the pencil test. So technically, you'd be classified non-white or colored. And if you want to check this out, go onto your favorite browser and type in the pencil test, and you'll see what will come up. And this was the system that was used to determine race. If you want to see an actual example of this, watch a movie called Skin. It's about the life of a girl called Sandra Lang and a brother who were born to white parents, but they didn't look white, so they were allowed to go to white-only schools. And of course, Sandra's whole life was upended and ended up having to go for a tribunal where they determined that she was actually colored and was not allowed to go back to the school. So everywhere you went in South Africa during this period, every aspect of life, including the school you went to, the bus you could take, the hospital you could visit, was determined by the apartheid laws. There were signs everywhere that told you where you could and couldn't go. And so, it was just a very, very difficult life to be born into. And it was about making sure that non-white people were unseen. And in fact, if you were black growing up in South Africa, an alarm would go off at a certain time of the day towards the evening. And when the alarm went off, black people, if you didn't have permission to be in the city, you had to run to get your bus or your train. The idea was not to be seen because you'd be arrested. So everywhere you went, there were these signs that told you where you could and couldn't go, even on telephone boxes, even on taxis. If you wanted to go to a show, for instance, you had to make sure that you chose to go on the right night. So they would have shows for whites-only audiences and shows for non-whites-only audiences. And I remember I was in primary school when the Supremes came to South Africa. And they were so disappointed that they had to perform before segregated audiences. So they made a decision to end their tour of South Africa. And in fact, Durban was the last place that they were going to perform at. And in fact, Diana Ross was very, very vocal of the fact that they didn't want to. And so my head teacher at the time went to the last show. He was quite desperate to get Diana Ross's autograph. And of course, in conversation, he waited to the end. Diana asked him, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm a head teacher." And the next morning, the Supremes sang for us in assembly on their way to the airport, which was quite amazing. But everywhere you went, including on the beaches, you would see whites-only signs. And of course, one of the pivotal images that have stuck in my mind is one that I saw as a young boy when I started to learn to read. It was on a whites-only beach. It said white persons only, and it had a black dog. This didn't mean no dogs. It meant no black people. So the government was saying that black people were just like animals. They were just like dogs. So you can see how deep-rooted the racism was. Even in prison, prisoners were not immune from the apartheid laws. Nelson Mandela was in a prison cell which was about 8 by 7 feet. And as a consequence of being a black man, black prisoners were not allowed to sleep on beds. He slept on a blanket on the floor. Probably the worst still was the impact that apartheid had on black women, Because one of the few jobs you could do as a black woman was to become a servant. So you suddenly started to see adverts advertising skin lighteners and skin bleaching. And the whole idea being that if I lighten my skin, maybe I'll get a better job. Maybe I'll be seen with a lighter skin. So you can see how psychologically deep-rooted the system impacted black women. Dissent was not tolerated. My generation chose to stand up for better education, and of course the government sent in the police and the army to quell any protest, even though they were peaceful. But in the meantime, in the United Kingdom, a very humble vicar by the name of Trevor Huddleston decided to start the anti-apartheid movement, which became a movement for social change. Ordinary people in the United Kingdom started to organize protests led by the vicar, Trevor Huddleston. And people marched and protested, and it was amazing. We never got to see it because of the fact that the government didn't allow us to see it. The news was very tightly controlled. And of course, it all culminated in the Nelson Mandela birthday concert when he turned 70 while he was in prison, where thousands and thousands of ordinary people chose to support us. And finally, we were being seen by people that didn't even know us, which was quite incredible. And I will never forget how supported we felt, but of course the government didn't broadcast the concert because it was regarded as subversive. So it was banned in South Africa. And of course, our efforts all paid off eventually because Nelson Mandela was finally freed on the 11th of February, 1990. I will never forget that Sunday when he walked out of prison. I was one of those standing watching. And he walked out with Winnie hand in hand. It felt as if 60 million of us, black and white, had walked out of prison that day. It felt like finally we would be seen. And of course, after long negotiations, Nelson Mandela reached out to the people that had put him in prison to negotiate a free and democratic South Africa. We had our first elections. Everybody was allowed to vote. I got to vote for the first time, black and white, and of course Nelson Mandela became the first black president. For the first time in my life, when I cast my ballot, when I voted, I felt like a person. I felt like I was seen. I felt like I really mattered. And that was a common theme about everybody that participated in the vote. And of course, Nelson Mandela confined the apartheid system to the dustbins of history, got rid of all the apartheid laws. And today, as we sit here, sadly, we're living in a world that's riddled with conflict. There's conflict all over the world. There are people that have been bombed into subjection. There are people that have lost everything. People feel that they are not seen. And as we sit here today, regardless of where the conflict is happening in the world, you and I are affected by whatever happens in the world. And if you're not affected, you need to become affected because people need to be seen and heard. We need to feel other people's pain. We quickly learned during the pandemic how when events happen anywhere else in the world, how we are all impacted. We discovered how, COVID and was really didn't need a passport. Viruses don't need passports. They can come in. And we suddenly realize how interconnected we are. So I'm really fascinated because we're living at such a terrible time where people are their rights are being denied, they're losing their homes, there's just wars and conflict. But yet, billions and billions are being spent to go to outer space. And I just worry that instead of going to outer space and spending all that money, how about us spending time connecting with the inner space of the heart? How about us connecting as human beings with our hearts and really feeling what other people are feeling? And I think it's really time for us to feel the pain that other people are feeling. I stand here today as a free man because ordinary people in the United Kingdom and all over the world chose to stand up and to speak for me. When I didn't have a voice, they spoke for me. When nobody else saw us in South Africa, they saw us from afar. So the common refrain, sadly, that we hear, even in this country, up and down, when things go wrong, particularly if you turn on the news channels or read the newspapers, one of the common things or refrains that we hear is people are always saying, we felt like we were not seen. It's almost as if we don't exist. And I just think we need to get back to that way of understanding that we need to feel people's pain. Nelson Mandela would always say he would always want to walk in other people's shoes, and he had big feet, by the way. But he felt that he needed to walk in other people's shoes. And whenever there would be, a guest that come to see him, they would always leave saying they'd never felt so seen and so heard. So in closing, I'd like you all to stand. And what we're going to do now is practice this Zulu greeting. So look at the person on the left and say, Sawubona. And look at the person on the right and say, Sawubona. Now choose the better looking of the two. I'm joking. Thank you very, very much for listening.